Thank you very much, Fred. Very much appreciate you hosting this today. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's always good to be back among so many friends and colleagues and fellow wonks at the Peterson Institute. Today marks an important anniversary in U.S. trade policy. It was just about a year ago that the administration and Congress joined together to announce a return to bipartisanship in U.S. trade policy. Sadly, since that time, we've made only limited progress reaping the benefits of that historic day. Yes, you should anticipate a bit of preaching to the choir, since as experts and scholars, you appreciate the importance of the U.S. commitment to free and fair trade for American workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs. You understand the need for a level playing field for American goods and services in the international marketplace, a marketplace where 95% of potential consumers lie outside our borders, a marketplace in which we must compete to succeed. The last time I was here, my comments focused on achieving a strong finish to the Doha round, where we continue to press for an ambitious and a balanced outcome. The President's commitment to the round is unequivocal. The process in Geneva rolls on, and my schedule continues to take me wherever there are trade ministers interested in finding that elusive breakthrough. As was the case when we met in February, the big question for the round is whether the emerging markets like China, India, and Brazil are willing to make contributions to the global market opening commensurate with their levels of development and economic growth. Doha, however, is a round to determine the terms of trade in decades to come, a round for 2015, 2020, and beyond. And so today I want to focus closer to home, on the side of our trade agenda devoted to countries that share our impatience with those who hold back from making market opening contributions needed to move the multilateral agenda. Countries that have joined with us to achieve strong bilateral and regional free trade agreements. As most of you know, early in my career I had the privilege of working for Senator John C. Danforth of Missouri when he chaired and then subsequently served as ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee's International Trade Subcommittee. It was the 1980s, and trade policy was truly bipartisan. Yes votes in trade agreements were the default, and you were held to account for voting no. In fact, the situation then and the pro-trade agenda being pursued by the Bush administration today really date back to the post-Smoot-Hawley era when Democrats like FDR and Cordell Hull led us into a new age of trade liberalization. Truth be told, it took Republicans until the Eisenhower administration to embrace the benefits of free trade. And for the decades that followed, free trade remained a bipartisan goal that brought with it immense domestic and global economic growth, prosperity, and peace. Our nation's commitment to free and fair trade began to unravel in the 1990s with cynical electoral demagoguery. It became most pronounced in votes on key trade pacts like the North America Free Trade Agreement and DR-CAFTA. Like most of you here today, Democrats, Republicans, and agnostics alike, the importance of maintaining bipartisan support for free trade is ingrained in our psyche. In my case, this core commitment to bipartisanship was the main reason I returned to government in 2005. It was the focal point of my confirmation as USTR and the foundation of my initial approaches to the leadership of both parties on the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees, well before the November 2006 election. And this was not because I'm particularly political, but because I recognized that a partisan rift engulfing U.S. trade policy impairs both executive and legislative branches, thereby undermining U.S. economic and security interests. The bipartisan traditions that characterized our nation's trade policy served us well for over half a century and are perhaps most evident in our approach to negotiating and implementing trade agreements. Trade Promotion Authority, or Fast Track, was developed as a statutory bargain between Congress and the executive branch in 1974, and it has benefited every U.S. president and our economy ever since. TPA allows Congress to provide guidance in advance of a negotiation, to be engaged throughout the negotiation, and to have the final say when the agreement comes to a vote. It was designed to guarantee to the President and our trading partners that once the trade agreement is reached, it will receive a timely vote without amendment on the merits. Or at least it did until a few weeks ago. However, we know that trade policy is a process of give and take. So when Democrats achieved majority in 2006, a recalibration of our approach to bilateral trade agreements made sense. We needed to do all that we could to help the majority of Democrats return to the bipartisan, free and fair trade center. It was May 10, 2007 when the administration reached an historic agreement with Congress on a new bipartisan way forward for America's free trade agreements. After many months of negotiations with the Ways and Means Committee and the House leadership, the administration agreed to include enforceable labor and environmental standards in our pending FTAs with Peru, with Panama, with South Korea, and of course with Colombia. Then, with the understanding and forbearance of our 4 trading partners, we were able to include these new provisions within the 4 corners of each pending FTA. So we delivered on our commitments in good faith, fully anticipating, as did our trading partners, that the Congress would do the same. The new bipartisan trade deal was intended to break a decade-long stalemate on labor and the environment, with the expectation that these new provisions would garner strong bipartisan support. We had hoped to move swiftly, but it took congressional Democrats 8 more months to approve the Peru FTA. Finally, though, when the Peru FTA came up for a vote, it was overwhelmingly bipartisan. And the sky did not fall, and the earth did not shake, and to my knowledge, no locusts appeared. Yet Peru is only one of the 4 FTAs that has ever received, is the only one of the 4 FTAs that has ever received a hearing, let alone the vote Congress promised to deliver under TPA. And now a year has passed since the May 10 agreement, and Congress has found excuse after excuse for delay. When the day of reckoning for the next agreement, the Colombia FTA, arrived more than 16 months after it was signed and close to 11 months after the bipartisan agreement, the Democratic leadership of the House changed the rules of the game. They changed the rules not only for themselves, but also for the Senate, for the administration, for the United States, and for our Colombia allies, unilaterally upending 34 years of U.S. trade law, policy, and practice. Over and over again during the past year, we have demonstrated our willingness to be flexible, to be patient, but we need a congressional partner who is willing to be reasonable in return. Yet in spite of more than 400 meetings and conversations with members of Congress since September, including dozens with congressional leadership, and in spite of nearly 160 consultations in connection with the 2-year negotiation of the agreement itself, we seem no further along a path forward than we were a year ago. The promise of May 10 remains unfulfilled. With respect to the Colombia FTA, House Democratic leaders declared on June 29, 2007, that before a vote, they wanted to see, quote, concrete evidence of sustained results, unquote, of reduced violence and impunity in Colombia. This is a goal that Colombia's leadership has more than met for the benefit of its own people. In fact, President Uribe's accomplishments in this arena and Colombia's 6% GDP growth rate no doubt helped to account for his 80+% approval rating at home. All recent studies show that levels of violence have been reduced dramatically while prosecutions and convictions are up. Evidence of these initiatives and successes were shared with the congressional leadership by the government of Colombia in a report by the Clinton administration's drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, and in a study by CSIS, among others. But that wasn't enough. Because then, we were told, that the congressional leadership wanted us to help deliver a strong bipartisan vote on Peru. Done. Then we were encouraged to take members of Congress to Colombia to see progress for themselves. And to date, Bush administration cabinet officers have escorted 55 members of Congress to Colombia. To recap, clear progress on violence and impunity, a strong vote on Peru, congressional delegations to Colombia, and obviously the labor and environment provisions. We have met every benchmark, but still no mock markup, not even a hearing at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. In fact, at the leadership's request, the President repeatedly held off submission of all 3 remaining FTAs in order to reach agreement on timing. We called for hearings and mock markups on the FTAs, but in an unprecedented move, the Congress did nothing. And most recently, we were told that Congress wanted action on trade adjustment assistance before they would move forward. Now, to be clear, the President has repeatedly called for reauthorizing and improving TAA, and yet the House has yet to seriously engage with us despite our repeated requests. So again, we wait. Keep in mind that every day that a vote on the Colombia FTA is delayed means our other pending free trade agreements with Panama and Korea are also delayed. Between the 3, we are losing out on the much-needed near-term opportunity to generate exports and export-led growth to almost 100 million potential customers. And we are effectively imposing an unnecessary tax burden on our own exports. These FTAs involve countries that have agreed to open their markets fully to U.S. exports. And, in the case of Colombia and Panama, they already benefit from almost unlimited duty-free access to the U.S. market under preference programs. In the case of the Chorus FTA, we have an opportunity to level the playing field with a nation with traditionally high barriers. The Korea agreement looks to boost annual U.S. exports and GDP by more than $10 billion tariff cuts alone. These agreements have important potential to help thousands of small and mid-sized firms that already export to Colombia, Panama, and Korea, and that compete with China and others in these markets. Our workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs stand to gain from better access, as well as better protection of intellectual property rights. And of course, we now have in place special labor and environmental protections. The fact of the matter is, delaying the vote on the Colombia FTA does not create one American job, it does not put one more dollar in anyone's pocket, does not save one life, does not help one union to organize, or protect one endangered species. I talked to dozens of our trading partners around the world, and they cannot fathom why Congress appears to be abandoning key allies. We know that globalization is not going away. It is a fact on the ground. Our real challenge is to ensure that American workers and enterprise are positioned to compete in the international marketplace. And we are not alone in our belief in the caliber of these deals. How often do you see editorial writers at the San Francisco Chronicle agree with those at the Wall Street Journal, or the Daily Oklahoman, or Ohio's Columbus Dispatch? Well, they all agree on the Colombia FTA. U.S. trade policy should not, and does not, have to be a partisan battleground. Plenty of leaders with track records and strong democratic credentials have spoken out forcefully in support of the Colombia FTA. Mayors such as Chicago's Mayor Daley, New Orleans' Ray Nagin, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania's Stephen Reed. Governors such as New Mexico's Bill Richardson and Virginia's Timothy Kaine. Former cabinet and White House officials like Mac McLarty, Bill Daley, Lee Hamilton, and the list goes on. The bottom line is that through the bipartisan agreement on May 10 of last year, the key winner is the American people. The Republican administration and the Democratic-led Congress ultimately share the credit for 4 terrific free trade agreements. Now we share the responsibility to see them enacted into law. Today, more than ever, we need congressional leadership to do the right thing and to bring the next 3 up for a vote this year. So today, 1 year after what was supposed to be a new era in trade policy, we find the trade agenda, a critical component of our national economic and foreign policy, at another stalemate. We look to the Speaker of the House to move us forward because she is the only one who can. We find the Colombia Agreement held up not by the merits of the agreement, but by partisan politics. As Chairman Rangel has said with respect to the Colombia Agreement, it isn't the facts on the ground, it's the politics in the air. Yet we know that many House Democrats support the Colombia FTA, and we believe if members of the House were allowed to vote their consciences, were allowed to vote on the merits of the agreement, a majority would vote to approve the Colombia FTA. The administration remains committed to getting the Colombia FTA, as well as agreements with Panama and South Korea, approved this year with bipartisan support. We believe that American workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs deserve the benefits that these agreements will bring. We also believe that the people of Colombia deserve to know that they can count on the United States, one of its closest allies in the Western Hemisphere. They have come so far in bringing peace and hope to their country, and this agreement will assist them in their efforts by creating economic opportunity. That's why I'm here today. Saturday will be the first anniversary of our bipartisan agreement with the Congress, and yet America's workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs remain at a disadvantage, a self-imposed disadvantage. If we don't stand up for good trade deals, we isolate ourselves from the international marketplace. The hard decisions are the ones needed to ensure U.S. competitiveness into the future. Votes to make one-way trade arrangements into two-way streets should be both easy and worth the time and energy to explain to constituents. We do a disservice to the American people by pretending that somehow trade is the culprit of our economic ills and anxieties, because that implies the solutions are easy and that they rest in the trade arena when they do not. However, with leadership comes responsibility and accountability, and our leaders should be held accountable if they squander one of the most effective tools of so-called soft power available in the world today. In this case, soft power that can benefit all concerned, all possible dimensions of peace and security. And so once again, I call on the congressional leadership to bring the Colombia FTA to a vote. Let's move on with our agenda. A year is far too long to wait. Thank you.
Susan, that was clear and forceful. Let me, maybe at the outset, broaden the discussion, though I'm sure we'll come back to the specifics of Colombia and the other FTAs. What has bothered me about the House action of April 10, even more than putting off maybe indefinitely the Colombia FTA, was the violence that I think it did to the processes of U.S. trade policy. On my reading, Congress, or the House, essentially repudiated the procedural basis on which U.S. trade policy has proceeded on a bipartisan basis for over 35 years. It did so by changing the rules and saying that the House no longer had to consider administration submissions under the fast-track time deadlines. That means several things. It means they could stall forever and never take it up. It means if they could change that rule, they could change the rule having to do with amendments as well, so they could amend forever and adorn the bills with all sorts of additional problems. And third, it seems to me most profoundly, they have therefore told our trading partners that they cannot in any way depend on congressional action on negotiations carried out by presidents fully authorized and duly constituted to do so. And so to me, and there's a little policy brief in your material that I've handed out today, to me, the deep and truly profound implication of what's happened is to drive a gaping hole in overall U.S. trade policy for the foreseeable future. And even if you're successful in picking up the pieces and somehow cobbling together a Colombia agreement and Korea and Panama agreements by the end of the year, the damage has been done. The credibility of the process has been violated. I've had the leading trade negotiators, current or former, of three of the major trading entities in the world, the EU, Mexico, our NAFTA partners, and Korea, told me in just the last 10 days they would never negotiate with the United States under these terms, namely knowing that the Congress might never take up the issue, and if they did, might change it in ways that they chose. Now, that's a long comment and question.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So the question to you is, and I don't pretend to have an answer to, I'm wearing my Trade Promotion Authority pin from 2002. I thought that was appropriate to dig out on this occasion when TPA is again up for grabs. What can be done about that most profound, A, do you agree it's profound? B, if so, what can be done to put Humpty Dumpty back together now that the Congress has said the emperor has no clothes, we can change the rule any time, the rest of the world now knows that. What can be done to resurrect a foundation for trade policy by a country that has a presidential and congressional system dealing with the rest of the world, which is very different?
Obviously a very good question and a very eloquent commentary, and I couldn't agree more. And you have a paper circulating out there. I commend it to all assembled. No, it is, as a student of U.S. trade policy and American trade politics, this was an unprecedented move, utterly unprecedented. And the foundation of Trade Promotion Authority rests, as most of you know, what started out initially as tariff-cutting authority provided in advance, and we're talking, 1934 onward, as we got into the realm of non-tariff barriers in 1962 with the Kennedy round, Congress and the executive branch realized that we needed to come up with a formula that shared responsibility, that shared power, that had sort of the checks and balances that Congress needed, but the assurances that the executive branch negotiators and our trading partners needed, that if negotiators brought home a good agreement that complied with the mandates that Congress issued, it would get an up or down vote, and it would pass if you could get a majority of votes. That obviously has been turned on its head, and as you noted, 35 years of trade law, trade practice, trade precedent upended. And I would note the House unilaterally, as I noted in my comments, the House unilaterally doing that to not only itself, but also to the Senate and to the administration and to U.S. trade policy and to our allies. Now, we have seen different versions of Trade Promotion Authority and Fast Track over the years. And the action that was taken in the House was only taken with respect to one free trade agreement. It was not taken with respect to all of the pending FTAs. And I believe that or like to think that cooler heads will prevail and realize that really Congress and the House leadership did itself no favors by making this move, because now the burden to move forward is 100% on the Speaker of the House and on the House Democratic leadership. It is no longer a shared burden. It is, and it was done in a procedural manner, perhaps in an effort to mask substance or politics, but the fact remains it is going to be up to the House Democratic leadership to bring the Colombia FTA to the floor or it will have killed the Colombia FTA. So going forward, I think that first of all, when it comes to free trade agreements, the interesting irony here is that the Colombia agreement is identical to the Peru agreement. And if you look at the overwhelming majority, bipartisan majority, who voted yes on the Peru agreement, they're going to have to explain if they get to the point of voting no on the Colombia agreement, because it is identical except the Colombia market is bigger for U.S. exports. So let's begin with that sort of awkward fact on the ground. But I think going forward, it would be hard to consult more than we did. I offered some of those statistics. We consulted extensively. I think the dynamic in terms of multilateral trade agreements is somewhat different. Democrats have a much stronger history of supporting multilateral trade agreements. So I think, discussion about the Doha round is a different category. But it does raise a dilemma, and if you think you're going to be the President of the United States, you're going to hope and wish and pray that you have the authority to negotiate trade liberalizing agreements, and that you have a de facto partnership with the United States Congress, regardless of who's in charge, so that America can pursue our national economic and security objectives and use this, use trade agreements as part of that policy arsenal.
I can't resist just embellishing that last point, and then we open it up. Imagine an administration, a new administration, roughly a year from now, or less than a year from now, comes into office wanting to change the orientation of U.S. foreign policy, overcoming what it will portray as a legacy of the past that was unilateralist, uncooperative, and therefore not very effective. Yet if it comes in with an inability to pursue trade issues in a cooperative, multilateral, friendly way, it will face an inherent contradiction at the core of its overall foreign policy.
That's right.
And it seems to me that conflict should concern anyone with a keen interest in both having a new administration and with success to that administration. Because otherwise there's going to be a huge tension. Imagine the new administration taking a big initiative to deal with global warming, which surely it will. Well, you can't take a big initiative on global warming without having a big trade dimension of that, because you have to handle the trade flows between scores of countries with different global warming policies. But if you don't have any authority to negotiate on trade, or no basis for thinking that what you do negotiate on trade will then be enacted by the Congress of the United States, how can you take the lead on global warming? So you've got some really profound implications of what has happened, going way beyond Colombia and even Panama and South Korea, it seems to me, which have just got to get straightened out. Having said that, I will acknowledge, I think this is a very difficult issue intellectually. Now that the Congress has said blatantly to the world, we can change our rules anytime we wish to do so, it's going to be hard to put together a foolproof trade promotion authority that will be credible. And that, I think, is the trick that we're all going to have to work on and figure out some method, because if not, the costs will be very, very high.
I could not have said it better myself. I will add to your scenario the fact that as we speak, there are well over 100 bilateral and regional FTAs being negotiated around the world. Those are not going to pause, even if we do. And they will proceed, and how long will it be before the new administration is even able to engage in bilateral or regional trade agreements, as we are progressively locked out of preferential deals being negotiated by our trading partners with each other?
The rest of the world is unlikely to call a timeout, you're saying. Okay, the floor is open.